Shii-Cho was an Onderonian metallurgist who lived 4 millennia before the Battle of Yavin. Compelled by the dark power of a Sith tome he had obtained, Dovos used the instructions provided to construct a set of Sith-style dark armor. Upon completing the suit, Dovos was accosted by the ancient Sith spirit that guarded the tome, who erased his mind and alchemically bonded him to the armor, remaking him into the Sith warrior Warb Null. Entering into the service of the Onderonian King Omin, a powerful Sith sorcerer, Null became one of his frontline fighters during the Freedom Nard uprising, Omin's attempt to reassert his own authority after the death of his regent, Sith adept Queen Amanoa, at the hands of the Jedi. Warb Null was killed early on in the conflict, beheaded by the Jedi Knight Ulic Qel-Droma. His death was ultimately deemed a small loss by his masters, who were more concerned with testing the latent power of Qel-Droma. After the conflict, his remains were secreted away on remote world Neekt Ka, on the frontier of the old Sith Empire. Located during the Clone Wars by the Jedi archaeologist Rieli and his retainer, failed Jedi Talati Kilmamna, the dark side power of the armor seduced the bitter Kilmamna. Donning the armor and killing Rieli with Null's lightsaber, Kilmamna rechristened himself Malleus, the Hammer of the Dark Side. A whipped native to Tula, Kakruk was born during the decades leading up to the rise of the Empire. Like all the Jedi of his era, he was recruited into the Order at an extremely young age, and eventually became apprenticed to Jedi Master Lilit Tusis. The pair were involved in the Yinchuri crisis in 33 BBY, and Kakruk was forced to watch helplessly as Tusis was slain in battle. Though he survived the conflict and completed his training under another master, Kakruk would be haunted by Tusis' death for the rest of his life. While he wasn't present for the Arena Massacre, he was involved in the Battle of Geonosis, and as with the majority of the Jedi Order, he accepted a post as a general in the newly formed Grand Army of the Republic. His first campaign during the Clone Wars was the assault on Tyre, and though the battle was a Republic victory, Kakruk was deeply disturbed by his experiences there, which flew in the face of everything he had been trained to believe in as a Jedi. Briefly deserting, he began to consider defecting to the Separatist war effort, and seeking guidance, he attended a meeting of Jedi dissidents hosted by Sura Bulk on Rule. However, the meeting was revealed to be an elaborate trap. Bulk, now a Separatist agent, planned on killing the attendees and pinning their deaths on Mace Windu, in an attempt to convince any further dissident Jedi at large that the Jedi Council was out for blood, and driving them into the arms of the Separatists. Fortunately, the plan was a failure, and being on the receiving end of Separatist brutality reaffirmed Kakruk's loyalty to the Jedi and the Republic. Despite many close brushes with death, Kakruk survived until the war's end, only to be confronted by the advent of the Great Jedi Purge. Narrowly surviving attacks at the hands of turncoat clone troopers, Kakruk took custody of a group of Jedi initiates and hopped planet to planet looking for a safe place to lie low with his charges. Settling on the backwater world of Arkinia, he established a hidden Jedi enclave in the ruins of an old outpost, and proceeded to guide his charges through the trials of the Dark Times, eventually joining Luke Skywalker's new Jedi Order. Living for well over a century, Kakruk ascended to the role of Jedi Grand Master, and led the Order through its next time of crisis, the Third Jedi Purge, initiated by Darth Krayt's One Sith Order.
Hello, YouTube! This is Jen Sarai presenting my latest Versus video. As you may have noticed, the guy who narrated the biographies was not me, and that is because my poor microphone just died on me and I'm stuck using my cheap backup mic until I can get it replaced. And as you may have noticed, this cheap backup mic does not provide a very clean recording. In response, I turned to our video making community for help, and Ready4 was kind enough to handle the voiceovers for me so I don't need to delay the video. For this analysis, as was the case with Kaosen Durach, using Warb Null in a short created a foundation for a firmer and more comprehensive understanding of the character. I have to extend my gratitude to my fan base, as many of the comments on the blunt instruments proved invaluable when drafting this more detailed breakdown of Warb Null. When I completed this breakdown, I presented it to Matt Chapman in order to get his opinion on who I should pit against Warb Null, and he suggested Kakruk. Going into this, I must admit that I was only moderately interested, but as I started to put in some serious research on Kakruk, it dawned on me just how brilliant this matchup is, and I got so excited about it that I put another project on hold, just so I could work on this one. In this video, I shall be following the same revised format that I employed in Kaosen Darach vs Sora Bulk, laying out each section in order of relevance, and with the martial arts breakdown coming last, and the conclusion for that section being worked into the verdict. The reasoning behind this is that, as with my previous video, both combatants involved are dedicated martial artists and swordsmen, with the final result of the fight being dictated by their skill in that area, all other factors being secondary. So, to streamline things, I'm simply making the most relevant conclusion the conclusion. I would do the same thing if I were comparing two dedicated force wielders such as Vulfe Karko and Joris Sabayoth. Evan, get on that! Simply making the force ability conclusion into the verdict. Also, just to clarify, I will be focusing on Kakruk within the time frame of the Dark Times, when he is serving as the leader of the Arcinian Enclave, so his feats and capabilities within the Legacy comics will not factor into my analyses. For obvious reasons, I don't think that Warb Null would stand much of a chance against a Jedi Grandmaster. And with all of that out of the way, let us proceed with Warb Null versus Kakruk.
When he set about creating the dark armour that would eventually become his new skin, Shas Dervos was forced to extensively study Sith alchemy and magic, hybridizing this arcane knowledge with his pre-existing skills in metalworking. His obsession with the creation of the armour ultimately drove him to the dark side of the Force, and left him susceptible to the influence of the Sith Guardian spirit. His esoteric knowledge and skills were swept aside when he was remade, and Warb Null became a pure Sith warrior. As a combat specialist, Null's force abilities obviously took a back seat to his martial arts training. Despite this, he was no neophyte, even if he was a mere Sith acolyte and not a true lord. Within the Tales of the Jedi comics, Warb Null's capabilities are generally left pretty vague, so I looked to his entry in the Tales of the Jedi Companion in order to fill the blanks. I never thought much of Warb Null before I started researching him, so you can imagine my surprise when I saw the number of powers attributed to him, some of them indicative of master-level force wielders. His application of physical augmentation was primarily geared towards enhancing his already prodigious strength, bolstering his fighting style, though the enhancement of reflexes would be a necessary skill in order to be a viable lightsaber duelist. Null was also versed in the use of hibernation trances, a meditative state where all bodily functions were slowed to an absolute crawl. As described in the Jedi Path, hibernation trances were the most extreme application of Force Heal, intended to deal with the most severe of injuries where more conventional applications of the techniques were insufficient, the best example being when Kakruk slipped into such a trance after being felled by Grievous on Hypori. While this obviously wouldn't help if he were, for example, decapitated, it does improve Null's overall survivability. Similarly, his use of Resist Stun and Tutor Minis further improved his defensive viability. Force Stun was used by Jedi to disable targets in a non-lethal manner, inducing a catatonic state in subjects, and resisting this ability called for considerable willpower. Tutor Minis allowed practitioners to absorb and channel otherwise harmful surges of energy, the basic application allowing for the deflection of blaster bolts, and more advanced applications allowing for the manipulation of force lightning, and there are cases of individuals using this power to catch lightsaber blades. Whatever the extent of Null's aptitude with this ability, it is extraordinarily difficult to use in any capacity, and being able to use it at all is indicative of advanced skill and power. This focus on defensive viability ahead of offensive might really set Warb Null apart from the vast majority of other Darksiders. Rather than being an unstoppable force, he was an immovable object, a rock on the seashore. Null has never been witnessed employing telekinetic powers, has never been subjected to any, and has never been credited with any, which leaves us with little to no information on what level of skill he had in this regard, if he has any at all. However, based on the powers that he is known to possess, and looking at the ways in which he has employed them, we can make an educated guess. Given his overwhelming emphasis on defensive abilities, it is likely that his application of telekinesis is entirely specialised towards defending against attacks of this nature, but at the complete expense of his ability to use them. And here we see his major weakness as a force wielder. His focus on defense at all costs completely undermines his ability to employ the force for attack. His sole offensive ability, the Aura of Uneasiness, was largely passive, subtly undermining the concentration and focus of his opponents rather than actually harming them, essentially a downgraded version of battle meditation. However, I honestly believe that the Aura is actually a more viable and useful telepathic attack than Darth Zana's spells of Fear and Madness, and its potency is not to be underestimated. Zana's spells were a massive exertion intended to rapidly overwhelm her target's psyche before they could mount a defense, an extremely demanding power and a wasted effort if unsuccessful. The Aura was much less demanding, easily maintained even in the heat of combat, and the whole point behind the power was to force opponents to divide their attention between fighting and combating its effects. Due to the Aura's simplicity and ease of use, I believe that it would be a viable tool even against the greatest force wielders of any given era, as its passive effects can only be endured and not simply dispelled, unlike Zana's abilities, which would be useless against adepts of that caliber. Warb Null possessed an advanced skill set, but rather than wield the force as a weapon, he used it purely as a defensive and supplementary tool, letting his lightsaber do most of the talking. When breaking down and analysing the force abilities of Jedi and Sith combatants, it is just as important to consider how they have not used the force as how they have. In the case of Kakruk, it becomes quite clear that he is not a dedicated combative force wielder, employing his powers only rarely in conventional battlefield situations, and never in any of his contests with opposing force adepts and lightsaber duelists. Not against Ventress, not against Voss, not even against Grievous. As a force wielder, I believe that Kakruk is in the same vein as Qui-Gon Jinn, being an example of force attunement rather than force power. He works hard to develop a philosophical understanding of, and live in concert with, the Force in his day-to-day life, but the use of its power does not figure heavily into his approach to combat. This doesn't mean that Kakruk is a weakling or an amateur. He is in fact quite advanced and powerful. His focus is simply lie elsewhere. It must be noted that this de-emphasis on combative force abilities did not translate to inability, as he has demonstrated some surprising levels of magnitude with telekinesis, on one occasion scattering several Yanshori warriors with an exceedingly powerful force push, and even more impressively, pulling an ore hauler out of the sky on Arkinia. However, such displays were exceedingly few and far between, and as mentioned, never figured into any of his engagements with opposing force wielders. In fact, during his tussle with Quinlan Voss, he was frequently on the receiving end of such powers, and failed to respond in kind even during the height of his rage. This incident could be taken as an indication of vulnerability against telekinetic strikes, though I personally believe that this is more so a demonstration of Quinlan Voss's supreme latent power with the Force, as opposed to any weakness on Kakruk's part. As I think I have made quite clear, Kakruk prized utility skills with a broad range of applications, and that improved his survivability ahead of offensive powers of any sort, but his displays of power have been no less impressive for it. A high level of skill with Force Heal allowed him to treat moderate wounds both in himself and others, and hibernation trances paired off with his whipped physiology enabled him to survive and gradually recover from otherwise fatal wounds. For a de-emphasis on combative force abilities to be viable, one would have to develop a solid faculty with force-based physical augmentation to allow for a pure reliance on lightsaber combat. Time and again, Kakruk has augmented his reflexes to allow for blast deflection, and relied on superhuman acrobatics to rapidly cover ground, rushing adversaries. As far as telepathic powers went, Kakruk was capable, but nothing to write home about. He was versed in the basic mind trick, and was credited with an immunity to fear effects and mental interference. However, in my view, this immunity should be taken with a pinch of salt. Rather than being a true immunity, I see it more as an indication that a Jedi is capable of mounting a defense against such powers, their success ultimately hinging on their mental fortitude. For example, if confronted by Darth Zana's spells of Fear and Madness, an emotionally unstable Jedi like Anakin Skywalker would be incapable of guarding against such powers, whereas a serene and strong-willed Jedi like Obi-Wan Kenobi could fend them off no problem. While Kakruk is not an unstable lunatic like Anakin Skywalker, he does have his share of emotional hang-ups, and while I think that he could mount a defence, it would be no easy feat for him. At the end of the day, Kakruk was... I hesitate to call Kakruk an academic Force wielder, as his skills were actually quite practical. They simply weren't oriented for combat. Warb Null is a dedicated combative Force wielder in the sense that his powers are geared towards combat. However, his defensive focus means that he isn't much of a threat to others, his viability determined purely by his ability to nullify their powers rather than strike out at them. But due to Kakruk's utilitarian focus, this defensive emphasis is almost overkill. Aside from Null's aura of uneasiness, which is almost purely passive, offensive powers of any sort do not figure into their fighting methods. While I sincerely doubt that Warb Null is incapable of defending himself against telekinesis, a vulnerability of this sort is not a huge deal against Kakruk, considering how actively the Jedi Master refrains from employing this power, especially against other Force wielders. Basic physical augmentation feeds into martial arts training, and I'll be detailing those conclusions later. The use of hibernation trances provide the same benefits, and therefore cancel out. Null's applications of Tutu Minis and Resist Stun aren't all that relevant, as Kakruk isn't capable of any of the attacks that these powers are designed to defend against. All they can do is counter what little the other is bringing to the table, nothing more. What really decides the edge here is how Kakruk combats Null's aura of uneasiness. I do think that Kakruk could effectively guard against the effects of the power, but this would force him to divide his focus, which means that the aura would still have accomplished its purpose. I have to stress that this would be an exceedingly minor advantage for Null, and would hardly be decisive. But, however insignificant this advantage may ultimately be, Warb Null gets the edge as a Force wielder. As a blacksmith, Shas Dovos would have already been an extremely fit individual, though his capabilities were pushed into the realm of superhuman by the Dark Force rituals that made him into Warb Null. Bonded to his armour by Sith alchemy, Null became a towering giant empowered by the dark side, and a devastatingly powerful warrior. The armour made him extremely resilient against injury, and even had a limited ability to withstand lightsabers, though this came at the cost of his agility due to the armour's cumbersome weight. While this was a significant weakness, Null did develop his lightsaber technique to compensate for this shortcoming. When it came down to it, Warb Null was a powerful and durable battlefield juggernaut, proceeding into combat as a slow-moving but utterly inexorable tank. A whipped native to the icy world of Tula, Kakruk was a tall, bulky, fur-covered biped who boasted both great strength as well as numerous cold weather adaptations. A thick layer of blubber insulation and natural oils in his fur that repelled water allowed him to swim in the frigid seas of his homeworld. As a result, Kakruk had a strong preference for cooler weather. As a natural predator, Kakruk's strength was backed up by razor-sharp claws and tusks, which in turn bolstered his applications of unarmed combat. His highly refined sense of smell also allowed him to operate as an effective tracker. When severely injured, Whippets had the ability to drop into a hibernative state in order to moderate the damage, and gradually recover, which when paired off with Kakruk's knowledge of Jedi meditation and healing trances, allowed him to survive otherwise fatal injuries on numerous occasions, to the point where he gained a reputation for being practically unkillable. Much as I hate to admit it, the only frame of reference we have for the sort of physical empowerment that Warb Null was subjected to is Savage Opress, who in my view was most easily compared to a well-built Wookiee, or a Whippet. Seen in that light, I'd place Null and Kakruk as relatively on par in terms of strength and endurance, with no major advantages one way or the other. Kakruk's cold weather adaptations and refined senses don't offset this equilibrium, as none of these traits would actually come into play in combat, and claws and tusks aren't really of much use against heavy armour. Warb Null and Kakruk are equals in terms of physicality. While many of the properties of Warb Null's equipment are mentioned elsewhere in the video, I will describe them in detail here. Null wore a full set of Sith-style dark armour, created through a combination of metalworking techniques and Sith alchemy. It was extremely durable, and as depicted in the short story Hammer, it had a limited ability to resist lightsabers, though a dedicated power blow could cut through it, which is how Warb Null was slain in the first place. Empowered with the dark side of the Force, the armour augmented Null's Force abilities, as well as producing a deeply unsettling Force aura, which bolstered Null's use of the aura of uneasiness, undermining the concentration and focus of his adversaries. However, the cumbersome weight of the suit drastically limited Null's agility, and though he clearly developed his lightsaber technique to compensate, it was still a notable weakness and a major contributing factor to his death. Addressing his weapon, Warb Null appeared to wield a simple, long-handled lightsaber with a lengthened green blade, though it was in truth an ingeniously constructed double-bladed lightsaber with a carefully concealed secondary emitter. As demonstrated by Malleus, the purpose of the design was for the wielder to switch back and forth between the two blades in the midst of combat to confuse and off-balance opponents. Though this feature would be kept in reserve until needed, it's not something he's going to be using straight off the bat. Matt Chapman considers long-handled lightsabers to be the least practical weapon variant, as the elongated handle gets in the way and inhibits movement. While I definitely agree with this assessment in regards to the staff-like weapon carried by Darth Nihil, or the lightsaber pikes carried by the Imperial Shadow Guardsmen, I do not think that this limitation is nearly as big a deal when examining a weapon like Warb Null's. He has the improved leverage and reach offered by the lengthened handle, but he keeps it at a reasonable size so it does not become a hindrance. The lightsaber that was taken from Kakruk on Hypori was of a somewhat overlarge design with a double set of emitter guards and a green-hued blade. Due to the differences between this weapon and the more standard design that he carried in all of his other appearances, I do not believe it was actually his lightsaber. More likely, he was engaged in a concordance of fealty with another Jedi, which would have led to a very awkward conversation when the time came to get his own lightsaber back. Kakruk's regular saber was also green-bladed and oversized, but it was otherwise completely nondescript and is frankly more noteworthy for its behind-the-scenes backstory than for the design itself. The design is a work of fan art on the part of the creator of the website Luke Sabers, sadly now defunct. Jan de Ursma, the artist of Jedi Mace Windu, mistook the website to be an official source and incorporated the design into her artwork, inadvertently canonizing it. While I consider Warb Null and Kakruk to be equals in terms of physical ability, this equilibrium is dramatically offset by their equipment, and for obvious reasons, Warb Null gets the overall edge. Matt Chapman once said that one doesn't need to be the most battle-hardened in order to be the most viable in a contest. In my view, the best example of this principle was Darth Bane, who stood tall as one of the greatest duelists of his era, despite his limited practical experience. The number of serious lightsaber fights he was involved in are countable with the fingers on one hand, yet he maintained a highly advanced skill set through constant and intensive training and study. Seen in this light, Warb Null is not to be underestimated. His entry in the Tales of the Jedi Companion labelled him as a Sith warrior, and the comics made note of his martial prowess, indicating that he was a very high-level combat specialist. Based on the statistics presented on his character sheet for the Star Wars miniatures game, he was a battlefield tank who focused on crowd control, heavily favouring the use of wide, sweeping power blows that allowed him to lash out at multiple assailants, an emphasis that strongly suggested that he was a specialist in Shii-Cho lightsaber combat. The first lightsaber form developed, Shii-Cho was the tutorial style of the Jedi Order, emphasising simplistic blade work and disciplines, though when elevated to its highest levels, it became a wild and randomised fighting style. While such a chaotic and emotionally charged form would be quite appropriate for a Darksider, all indications are that Null did not fight in this manner, opting for a much more controlled and deliberate approach. Similarly to Darth Vader, it seems to me that Null's personal style was intended to both take advantage of and compensate for the properties of his armour. He would use the weight of his suit to root himself to the ground, becoming an immovable object when operating defensively, and an inexorable tank on the offensive, shrugging off hits and constantly moving forward. However, the resulting lack of agility became a serious weakness, and as mentioned previously, was a major contributing factor to his defeat at the hands of Ulik Qeldroma. Due to his focus on crowd control, I don't think that this is normally a big deal for him, as his adversaries would get in each other's way as they tried to swarm him, though it did suggest a weakness against lone enemies. But this would all be relative, as Null wouldn't have made for a very effective warrior if all he could do was butcher large groups of opponents only to be cut down by the lone survivor. It must also be remembered that Ulik Qeldroma was an extremely high caliber swordsman, commonly regarded as one of the best in his era. Plus, he was drawing on his rage to boost his combat performance. And no, that isn't foreshadowing at all. I think it is safe to say that Null is at a disadvantage against agile speed fencers, whose typical MO is to dance circles around slower adversaries. But against more conservative fighters, who similarly relied on their strength and endurance to power through, it was a much more balanced contest. As a heavily armoured melee tank, Warb Null essentially embodied the Sith warrior archetype, but there was a lot more to him than that, and certain elements of his style marked him as a very unorthodox fighter. This is made clear by the nature of his weapon. On the surface, a simple long-handled lightsaber with a lengthened green blade, providing greater leverage and reach. But as already mentioned, it was actually an ingeniously constructed double-bladed lightsaber with a carefully concealed secondary emitter. The Drukata style was one built on deception, designed to take advantage of one of the most unique features of the lightsaber, the retractable blade. As demonstrated by Malleus, the purpose behind this specialised weapon was to allow the wielder to switch back and forth between two blades in the midst of combat, catching opponents off guard. Whether or not Warb Null actually studied Drukata, he clearly had a firm grasp of its principle. Despite all appearances to the contrary, Null was far more than some tactless Cregor Clegane who just relied on brute strength and heavy armour to power through his opposition. He was a cunning warrior who approached combat in a very deliberate and thoughtful manner, planning his next action and moving forwards, slowly but relentlessly. He had his limitations to be sure, and was not invincible, but he knew how to work within his limits, and had contingencies in place to deal with the unexpected. Ulik Qeldroma, Kay Qeldroma, Os Willem. Three of the most talented up-and-coming knights in the Jedi Order, and Warb Null took on all three without breaking a sweat. A force to be reckoned with, and not to be underestimated. The first thing that must be understood about Jedi Master Kakruk is that he was not a dedicated lightsaber duelist. Those were not the parameters that he worked within. Like most Jedi of his day, his focus was on battlefield engagements with criminal organizations, paramilitary factions, and later actual armies during the Clone Wars. He was in his element with blast deflection, not dueling. All that being said, he was involved in engagements with several high-profile adversaries, and while he never won any of these bouts, the fact that he came away alive was an accomplishment in of itself. In fact, General Grievous rated Kakruk so highly as a challenger that the lightsaber he took from him on Ipori became one of his personal favourites. Kakruk may not have been a great master, but he was by no means a pushover either. As a Whippet, it stands to reason that Kakruk would have specialised in Form 5 lightsaber combat, in order to take advantage of his greater-than-human strength. Form 5 was created in answer to the perceived deficiencies of Form 3, and was built around the tactic of following up defensive manoeuvres with immediate offensive counters, seizing the initiative rather than passively responding to an adversary. It had two variants. Shii-Cho was designed for blast deflection, using aimed deflection to take out enemies or other targets of opportunity. So was designed for lightsaber dueling, using heavy power moves to turn aside attacks and to crash through an opponent's defences. Assuming that Kakruk was a Form 5 specialist, his primary style would likely have been Shii-Cho, in keeping with his emphasis on blast deflection, but technical aspects from So would have featured prominently as well, in order to take advantage of his physique. In keeping with this idea, the defining aspect of Kakruk's personal style was his reliance on his strength and endurance to withstand and power through the opposition, whether on the battlefield or in a duel. In this, he was wildly successful, one of the best examples being when he pulled through the extended infantry engagement on Ipori, and despite his visible exhaustion, still met Grievous head-to-head in a lightsaber duel without flinching. But being a strength-oriented power duelist did not mean that Kakruk was some immobile rock, and he could be very agile when he needed to be. Inexperienced but skillful, Kukruk would tailor his technique to suit the adversary and the situation, matching Asajj Ventress's balletic style on Rule, but employing a more grounded approach against Grievous. He has effectively combated dual blade fencing, and has himself made very intelligent use of unarmed combat techniques, thrashing Quinlan Vos on Coruscant. Kukruk may not have been a perfect warrior, but his weaknesses had nothing to do with his technique, instead everything to do with his tactics. He was very much a battlefield Jedi, wasting no time on anything fancy, simply charging in headfirst and hoping for the best. Under controlled circumstances, his approach was very static, adopting a technique tailored to the situation, but otherwise relying on his strength and endurance to power through. When a situation was exploding in his face, Kukruk would completely cut loose, and was known to fall into terrifying berserker rages and pummeling opponents with everything he had. However, these rages were a rare occurrence, and were only provoked by scenarios so bad that they caused him emotional distress, such as the death of his master during the Ginshori crisis, or his failure to prevent the assassination of Senator Viento at the hands of Quinlan Vos. While not one to back down in the face of overwhelming odds, he was not some emotionally unstable lunatic who was barely keeping it together. Ultimately, it was his inexperience as a duelist that was his most serious weakness, as he didn't always make correct situational assessments, and he wasn't trained to anticipate or deal with unorthodox tactics and manoeuvres. Perhaps the best example of these failings was his duel with Asajj Ventress. Ventress obviously outclassed him by a huge margin, yet he wasn't conducting himself like a desperate man struggling to keep up with a vastly superior opponent, which makes it clear to me that Ventress was just toying with him, and Kukruk failed to cue into this, mistakenly believing that he was tussling with an adversary of equal or near equal skill. Kukruk's duel with Ventress was depicted over the course of 3 panels in Jedi Mace Windu, the first 2 depicting very similar pirouetting manoeuvres, and the last being the pommel strike that Ventress used to subdue him. What I suspect happened is that she deliberately employed a very repetitive sequence of moves in order to lull him into a comfortable rhythm, before suddenly and aggressively changing her attack pattern and catching him off guard, a technique that I myself have fallen prey to in formal fencing matches. Grievous did something similar, baiting Kukruk by deliberately exposing his right arm, and when Kukruk went for it, Grievous exploited the opening by slashing him across the belly with his left-hand blade. Here we see demonstrated Kukruk's weakness against the unorthodox. Despite his failings, Kukruk was still an extremely formidable warrior. Of all the Jedi on Hypori, he was the only one that Grievous relied on trickery to defeat. All the others Grievous defeated by either preempting their attacks as they charged, or by powering through their defences outright. Admittedly, I believe this was a demonstration of Kukruk's endurance rather than his skill, as all the other Jedi were running on empty, and therefore easy prey, whereas Kukruk was closest to optimum capacity and therefore a challenge. Kukruk may have been an inexperienced duelist, but he was still a powerful one. While neither of them are by any means great swordmasters, both are extremely capable warriors, and though decisively outclassed by their respective adversaries, they were not pushovers. Both employed fighting styles intended to take advantage of their immensely strong and durable physiques, but they were smart enough not to stop there, developing sophisticated techniques tailored to their specific needs. Taken on their own merits, neither had an advantage on a basic technical level, because they are so similar, and in my view, this fight is ultimately determined by their tactics and their reserve skills. While Kukruk has employed some very agile footwork, dancing circles around his opponents was not his MO, meaning that Warb Null doesn't have much to worry about in this regard. And to be honest, I don't think that simple acrobatics are enough to bring down Warb Null, his defeat having more to do with the calibre of his opponent rather than the specific tactics or manoeuvres he employed. Do remember that King Omin and Freedon Nard both considered Null's defeat at Luke Keldroma's hands to be a foregone conclusion, and I don't think this is because they knew he was a good acrobat. Kukruk has extensive combat experience, and even some dueling experience against some of the most capable adversaries of his day, at least one of whom easily outclassed Warb Null, yet he is the odd one out in this contest. It comes down to this: one doesn't need to be the most experienced in order to be the most viable in a contest. What one does need is for the skill set and tactics they use to address the nature of the contest in question. and this is where the greatest divergence between Warb Null and Kakruk's skill set can be seen. Null may be more geared towards engaging Jedi on the battlefield than in single combat, but he is a dedicated lightsaber duelist whose skills and tactics are devoted to countering those of the Jedi, whether through brute force or deception. By contrast, Kakruk is not a dedicated duelist. He is geared towards conventional battlefield engagements with blaster-wielding assailants, and while he has proven that his technique is a viable dueling style, his tactics lack such versatility. Simply put, Kakruk is too straightforward and inexperienced. He adopts an approach or technique suited to the situation in question, and then sticks with it to the bitter end, relying almost solely on his endurance and strength to power through the opposition. He's by no means crude, but there is a heavy reliance on these elements in his method, no matter what the situation. And I'd say it comes at the expense of a more nuanced tactical mindset, and he has repeatedly failed to take advantage of circumstantial or environmental factors, or accounting for any unexpected tactics and maneuvers on the part of his opponents. All of these failings, particularly the last one, leave Kakruk at a severe disadvantage against Warb Null. Similarly to Obi-Wan Kenobi's first duel with Dooku, what we have here is a contest between a sword fighter and a fencer. This is actually an important distinction, particularly in the realm of lightsaber combat. The sword fighters of the Star Wars universe are all about employing bladed weapons against people with guns, using styles and tactics that are best described as a weaponized version of tennis. Duelists are all about blade-to-blade combat with other swordsmen, relying on traditional fencing styles and tactics that have simply been adapted for use with the lightsaber. Assuming that Warb Null is a Shii-Cho specialist, this would be especially true of him, as these are the disciplines that Form 1 lightsaber combat are derived from. Due to Kakruk's proven skills, this analogy applies purely to their tactics rather than their techniques, but Null's advantage is no less significant. However, while I consider Kakruk to be at a severe disadvantage, he is not helpless, and his defeat is no guarantee. Because their basic combat techniques are so similar and so comparable, their initial bout would be a contest of equals, with no clear result one way or the other. The fact that Warb Null maintains certain reserve skills is a major advantage over Kakruk, who maintains none, but his limitations in this area must also be understood. Null was a cunning warrior, but he was not a tactical or strategic genius. He maintained fallback options, but his options are still limited. He was not unintelligent, but at the end of the day he was still a blunt instrument, a battlefield tank who relied primarily on his strength and his endurance to power through the opposition. This slowness to adapt means that Kakruk stands a decent chance of overpowering Null before he can employ the alternative function of his lightsaber. These are two fighters who are comparable on almost every level, with the only difference between them being their different focuses, but when all is said and done, the odds still favour Warb Null, and the moment he employed his lightsaber in this manner he would penetrate Kakruk's guard and cut him down. While I do think that Kakruk is likely to survive this engagement, he would be soundly defeated. I declare Warb Null the victor.
For battle, come to me.